The skies shimmered with hues no mortal artist could capture. Rivers ran like threads of molten silver, whispering melodies as they wove through emerald forests and golden plains. The air itself seemed alive, fragrant with a sweetness that clung to the soul and filled hearts with a peace beyond words. This was not a world built by human hands, it was shaped by something greater, something sacred. At the heart of this paradise stood the parabolic watchers, beings of light and wisdom whose presence was both humbling and comforting. They were neither gods nor spirits but stewards, entrusted with nurturing harmony and balance. Each watcher bore a unique glow, their forms shifting like shimmering constellations. They spoke not with words but with parables, simple, powerful tales that resonated deep within the hearts of those who heard them. These stories shaped the rhythm of life, guiding the people with lessons of love, kindness, and unity. Humanity thrived under their care. Villages dotted the landscape, their structures blending seamlessly with the natural world. The people lived as caretakers, not conquerors, tending to the land with reverence. Children laughed as they played among flowering meadows, their joy as pure as the crystal-clear springs they danced around. Elders told tales by the firelight, recounting the watchers' teachings with a quiet reverence that filled every listener with awe. One of the watchers, a being named Elyon, often appeared by the great tree of ages. This towering sentinel was said to hold the stories of all that had ever been and all that would come to pass. Its leaves sparkled like stars, rustling softly as if whispering secrets only Elyon could understand. Children would gather around as Elyon spun tales of courage and humility, of forgiveness and love. Each story seemed to hold a fragment of truth so profound it left the listeners breathless, their eyes wide with wonder. It was not just children who were captivated. Farmers paused their work to listen, their hands resting on plows as they soaked in the lessons. Artisans shaped their crafts with the watcher's wisdom in mind, believing that beauty born from truth carried the power to heal. Even the animals seemed to sense the harmony, their movements calm and unhurried. Predators hunted only what they needed, and prey lived without fear, as if some unseen force held the world in perfect balance. Yet, there was something fragile in this perfection, though few dared to think it. Beneath the harmony lay a quiet hum of inevitability, like the faint vibration of a taut string just before it snaps. The watchers, for all their wisdom, carried a weight in their radiant eyes, a sorrow so faint it seemed almost imperceptible. When asked about it, they would smile and tell another parable, their light flickering just a little. One story, often told by a watcher called Seraphis, lingered in the hearts of all who heard it. It spoke of a garden where every plant thrived, each one unique yet essential to the whole. But one day, a single flower decided it wanted more sunlight, stretching higher than the others and casting shadows below. The garden began to wither, its harmony broken by one selfish act. The people listened in silence, a faint unease settling over them as if the tale was more than it seemed. Life continued in blissful rhythm, but the whispers of doubt began to grow. A farmer hesitated before planting his seeds, wondering if his neighbor's field would yield more. A craftsman frowned at his work, longing for recognition beyond his village. These moments were fleeting, so small they went unnoticed. But the watchers saw them. They always saw. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in shades of amber and rose, the watchers gathered beneath the great tree. Their light flickered more than usual, their forms dimmed as if burdened by an invisible weight. The people watched from a distance, their hearts filled with both curiosity and a strange, unshakable dread. Elyon stepped forward, his glow casting long shadows across the gathering. His voice resonated in their minds, gentle yet firm. "The balance is sacred," he said. "But even the most beautiful song can falter if one note is played out of tune." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The people exchanged uneasy glances, their joy tempered by a fear they could not name. They did not yet know that the cracks in their perfect world had already begun to spread. That night, a storm rolled in, unlike any they had ever seen. The winds howled with a mournful cry, bending even the strongest trees. Lightning carved jagged scars across the heavens, and the rain fell in torrents, washing away the sense of peace that had once seemed eternal. People huddled together, seeking comfort in one another's arms as the watchers stood silent, their light flickering weakly. When the storm passed, the world seemed unchanged on the surface. The rivers still shimmered, and the skies still held their otherworldly hues. But something was different. The songs of the birds carried a mournful note, and the air felt heavier, as if the land itself grieved. The watchers no longer walked among the people as freely as they once had, their presence becoming less frequent and more subdued. Despite this, life went on. The people planted their fields, told their stories, and cared for one another. Yet, the parables began to shift. Where once they spoke of harmony and joy, they now carried warnings, subtle but unmistakable. Tales of greed, pride, and the consequences of forgetting one's place in the tapestry of life became more common. The people listened, but the seeds of doubt had already taken root. One day, a young girl named Lyra stood before Elyon at the great tree. Her eyes, wide with innocence, searched his radiant form. "Why do the stories feel sad now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elyon knelt before her, his light dimmed but warm. "Because even the brightest light casts a shadow," he said. "And sometimes, we must walk through the shadow to understand the light." His words sent a chill through those who overheard, though they did not fully understand. But the watchers knew. They had always known. The world was beautiful, but beauty, too, can be fleeting. The first whispers came like the faint rustling of leaves before a storm, soft enough to be ignored, but carrying a weight that unsettled the soul. A man named Arel, known for his gentle hands and quiet smile, stood before his harvest one evening, staring at the golden waves of grain swaying in the breeze. His neighbors spoke of his good fortune, of how his fields seemed to yield more than others, but their words, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. Somewhere in his heart, a thought lingered, why should their praise satisfy me? Shouldn't I deserve more than mere words? Such thoughts were like seeds, barely noticeable at first but carrying the potential to grow into something far greater, and far darker. The days stretched on, golden and serene as they had always been, but beneath the surface, something began to shift. In the village square, laughter rang out as people traded stories and goods, but there were those who lingered in the corners, their smiles a little less genuine, their eyes a little more guarded. A group of craftsmen, led by a man named Darren, whispered among themselves as they watched the work of another artisan displayed with pride. Darren's voice was low, yet sharp. "His work is good, but why should it be valued more than ours? Are we not as skilled? Perhaps more so." The others nodded, their agreement filling the space like smoke, thin and barely visible but choking all the same. The watchers still appeared, their parables weaving through the air like threads of gold, but even their wisdom began to feel distant to some. In the fields, Arel listened to Elyon's tale of the humble stone that became the cornerstone of a great tower. Once, the story would have filled him with inspiration, a reminder of how even the smallest acts carried great meaning. But now, his heart burned with a quiet, unfamiliar fire. Why must I be the stone? Why not the tower itself? The question lingered, heavy and bitter. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible at first, but they spread like shadows across a sunlit meadow. In the bustling marketplace, people began to speak less of gratitude and more of what they lacked. One woman complained that her neighbor's fabrics sold faster than her own, though she could not see why. A young man envied the attention his brother received for his strength, though it was he who worked longer and harder. Such feelings were whispered only to trusted friends at first, but even whispers can be heard when enough voices join. The parabolic watchers noticed, of course. Their light dimmed slightly when they moved among the people, and their parables began to carry tones of caution. Elyon spoke of the flame that burns too brightly and consumes all around it. Seraphis told of the viper that bites its own tail, destroying itself in its hunger. But the words, so clear before, now seemed like distant echoes to many ears. The people still listened, but their hearts were no longer open as they once were. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of fire and shadow, a small group gathered by the river. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the sharp edges of dissatisfaction. Darren was among them, his face a mask of determination. "The watchers speak of balance," he said, his voice rising above the murmurs. "But what is balance if it keeps us small? They ask for humility while they stand above us, radiant and untouchable. Why must we live in their shadow?" The word struck something in the others, a chord of longing and frustration they had not dared to voice. A woman named Kale, her hands scarred from years of weaving, nodded. "They tell us we are free, yet we follow their stories like children. Are we not capable of deciding our own path?" The whispers grew louder after that night. They seeped into conversations at the market, into quiet moments by the hearth, into the minds of those who had once known only contentment. Some still clung to the teachings of the watchers, their faith unshaken. But even they began to feel the weight of doubt pressing at the edges of their hearts. The first act of betrayal was small, almost laughable in its simplicity. A young boy, jealous of his friend's prized flute, stole it in the dead of night and buried it beneath a tree. He felt a rush of satisfaction at first, but it was fleeting, replaced by a hollow ache he could not explain. The flute was found days later, its wood warped and ruined by the damp soil. The friend wept, and the boy, watching from afar, felt the sting of guilt, though he dared not confess. It was only a flute, a trinket. But it marked the beginning. In the quiet hours of the night, Elian stood beneath the great tree, his light flickering like a candle in the wind. Seraphis joined him, their forms casting faint glows across the ground. "It has begun," Seraphis said, their voice heavy with sorrow. "The seeds have taken root." Elian nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They must choose their path, even if it leads through shadow." The watcher's presence grew less frequent, their parables fewer and more somber. Some saw this as proof of the watcher's indifference, their absence feeding the resentment that simmered in the hearts of many. Others mourned their fading light, their prayers growing desperate as they clung to the hope that harmony could be restored. Arel, once a beacon of kindness in the village, stood alone in his fields one evening, the golden grain swaying around him like an ocean. His heart was heavy with thoughts he could not shake. Why should I work for others' benefit? Why should my labor feed those who do not toil as I do? The questions gnawed at him, their edges sharp and unyielding. He did not notice the shadow that crept over the horizon, a darkness that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. It was not a physical shadow, but something that touched the spirit, a weight that pressed against the heart and dimmed the light in every soul it touched. The village still thrived on the surface. The rivers still flowed, the skies still shone, and the laughter of children still rang out. But beneath it all, the whispers grew louder, their tone darker. They spoke of envy and desire, of dissatisfaction and pride. And though the watchers remained, their light now seemed more fragile, their wisdom less clear. One night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, Arel stood at the edge of the river, staring into its mirrored surface. He saw his own reflection, but it did not comfort him as it once had. Instead, it seemed to mock him, its eyes filled with the doubts and fears he tried to bury. The water rippled, distorting his image, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something else staring back at him, something darker, something waiting. The first whispers had become a chorus, and the harmony that had once defined the world began to crack. The tree of mirrors stood at the edge of the great valley, its presence both mesmerizing and haunting. Its branches stretched high into the heavens, glinting like polished silver under the light of the twin moons. Each leaf was a mirror, reflecting not just the faces of those who gazed upon them but something deeper, something hidden within. Legends said the tree held the truth of all things, the unvarnished reality of one's soul. None approached it without trembling. Arel stood before the tree now, his breath shallow, his heart a restless drumbeat. The whispers that had plagued him for weeks had grown louder, more insistent. Asterisk you deserve more. They do not see your worth, asterisk he clenched his fists, staring at his reflection in the mirrored leaves. His image stared back, but it was not quite his own. The eyes held something unfamiliar, an ambition that frightened him and thrilled him all at once. The Watchers had warned of the tree. Its beauty was unmatched, but its truths were heavy, almost unbearable. The Tree of Mirrors reveals not only who you are but who you might become, Elian had once said. It is a gift, but also a trial. To misuse it is to shatter the balance of all things. Aurel knew the words well. He had recited them himself as a child, sitting at Elian's feet. But the warnings felt distant now, like an echo from a dream. He stepped closer, the soft crunch of his footsteps breaking the valley's silence. The air grew colder, sharper, as though the tree itself was aware of his presence. The first betrayal had not yet been committed, but the weight of it hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. Aurel reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against a low-hanging leaf. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the surface rippled under his touch. The reflection shifted, revealing not just his face but scenes from his life, the toil, the quiet envy, the moments of doubt he had kept hidden even from himself. And then it showed something else, a crown atop his head, a crowd cheering his name. The vision burned in his mind, so vivid it felt real. He staggered back, his chest heaving. Asterisk a king. Could it be true? Asterisk the thought rooted itself in his heart, its tendrils weaving through every corner of his being. He turned to the silent valley behind him, half expecting someone to appear, to stop him. But he was alone. No watcher came to intervene. In the days that followed, Aurel's demeanor changed. He spoke less but carried himself with a new confidence, almost arrogance. Those who knew him well noticed the difference but dared not question it. He began visiting the tree in secret, each time staying longer, staring into its mirrored leaves with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The visions it offered grew bolder, images of power, wealth, and adoration. Yet, there were shadows too, flickers of destruction, of faces turned away in sorrow. He ignored those. The betrayal came on a night heavy with rain. The village gathered under the shelter of the great hall, their faces lit by the flickering glow of a central fire. Elian stood at the front, his light dimmed but steady as he recounted a parable. It was the story of the river and the mountain, a tale of trust and mutual dependence. The villagers listened, their hearts stirred by the familiar lesson. But Aurel sat apart, his gaze fixed on the flames, his mind elsewhere. When the parable ended, Elian turned to Aurel, his voice soft yet firm. You have been restless, Aurel. What troubles you? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Aurel, waiting for his response. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, he considered staying silent, dismissing the watcher's concern with a wave of his hand. But the whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him forward. I have seen the Tree of Mirrors, he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. Gasps rippled through the room. No one was permitted to approach the tree without the watcher's guidance. It was sacred, its truths dangerous if misused. Elian's light dimmed further, his form flickering like a failing star. You sought its reflection without understanding, he said, sorrow lacing his words. What did you see? Aurel rose to his feet, his voice rising with each word. I saw what you refused to show us. I saw a world where we are not bound by your rules, where we can be more than caretakers of this land. You keep us small, Elian. You speak of balance, but what of freedom? What of greatness? The Watcher's radiance faded almost entirely, leaving only a faint glow. The other villagers looked on in shock, their faces pale. No one had ever spoken to a Watcher this way. Aurel, Elian said, his tone heavy with grief, the tree shows possibilities, not certainties. It is a test, not a promise. You have seen only what you wish to see. But Aurel would not be swayed. The whispers in his mind roared now, drowning out all else. "You are afraid," he said, pointing an accusing finger at the watcher. "Afraid that we will outgrow you." Elyon did not respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the great tree, his movements slow and deliberate. The villagers followed, their fear and curiosity driving them forward. Arel led the way, his heart pounding with both triumph and unease. When they reached the tree, its mirrored leaves shone brighter than ever, as if aware of the tension in the air. Elyon stood beneath its branches, his light illuminating the ground around him. He reached out and touched one of the leaves. The reflection it showed was not his own but Arel's, his face twisted in anguish, the village in ruins behind him. Arel's breath caught in his throat. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "It is the truth you refuse to see," Elyon said, his voice filled with sorrow. "The first betrayal is not against me, but against yourself." But Arel would not listen. He reached for the tree, his hand grasping one of its branches with force. The mirrors shattered, their fragments raining down like shards of frozen light. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of breaking glass and distant cries. The villagers recoiled, their faces pale with fear. As the last shard fell, the tree darkened, its silvery glow extinguished. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. Arel stood frozen, his hand still clutching the broken branch. The whispers in his mind were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. Elyon stepped forward, his form now barely visible. "The covenant is broken," he said, his voice faint but unwavering. "The balance will not hold." The ground beneath the tree began to crack, thin fissures spreading outward like veins. A cold wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of weeping. The villagers fell to their knees, their faces wet with tears, though they could not say why. Something precious had been lost, something they had taken for granted until it was gone. Arel stood alone, his gaze fixed on the shattered remains of the Tree of Mirrors. For the first time, he understood the weight of his actions, but it was too late. The first transgression had been committed, and the world would never be the same. The dawn was different that morning. The golden light that once bathed the valley in warmth felt cold, as though the sun itself had turned its face away. People gathered in the village square, their faces shadowed by worry and doubt. The ground beneath their feet still bore faint scars from the night the Tree of Mirrors shattered, and though the surface had stilled, the earth seemed to hum with tension, as if the balance of all things hung by a thread. Two groups had begun to form among the people. It was not spoken aloud at first, only seen in the way they stood apart from one another, their gazes wary. Some, shaken but steadfast, clung to the teachings of the Watchers, their prayers louder, their faith more resolute. Others, emboldened by Arel's defiance or simply lost in their own discontent, turned inward, their actions guided by pride and self-interest. The village was no longer one. Among those who remained faithful, a quiet figure began to stand out. His name was Aaron, a young scribe who had spent his life copying the parables of the Watchers into sacred texts. His hands were stained with ink, and his robes were plain, but there was a light in his eyes that seemed unshaken by the darkness creeping into their world. He had no great strength or wealth, no commanding presence, but when he spoke, people listened. His words were steady, like the rhythm of a beating heart, and they carried a truth that could not be denied. One evening, as the village wrestled with the growing divide, Aaron stood before the great hall. A small group had gathered, their faces lined with worry and grief. The air was heavy, as though even the stars above mourned what had been lost. Aaron's voice was soft but firm, carrying through the silence. "Do you remember the parable of the unbroken cord?" he asked. His question hung in the air, met by nods and murmurs of recognition. "It speaks of a cord woven with many threads, strong enough to withstand any storm. But if one thread is pulled away, the cord frays, and it can no longer hold." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the group. "We are that cord. And now, we are fraying." His words struck a chord in those who heard them. Some wept openly, their tears falling to the earth like rain. But others, standing at the edge of the gathering, scoffed. Among them was Cale, a hunter who had once been a friend to Aaron but now carried an anger that burned hotter with each passing day. "What use are your words, scribe?" Cale said, his voice sharp. "Do you think prayers will fill empty bellies? Or that faith will protect us from what is coming?" Aaron did not flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes meeting Cale's. "Do you think pride will? Or that selfishness will build a better world?" The tension between them was palpable, the air charged with the weight of their opposing beliefs. Cale turned away, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. "You speak of unity, but it is already broken. There is no going back." Aaron watched him go, his heart heavy but unwavering. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. But he also knew that light, even a single flicker, could hold back the darkest of nights. As days turned to weeks, Aaron's presence became a beacon for those who sought hope. He did not lead with commands or force but with quiet acts of compassion. He sat with the grieving, mended broken tools, and shared what little he had with those in need. His words, written in ink and spoken in truth, spread among the faithful like seeds carried on the wind. They called him the Scribe of Light, a title he accepted with humility. But not all were moved by his example. The division grew sharper, the lines clearer. Those who followed Arel began to build walls, literal and figurative, separating themselves from the rest. They spoke of independence and strength, of a future unburdened by the Watcher's teachings. They saw Aaron's kindness as weakness, his faith as a chain holding them back. One night, a fire broke out in the marketplace. It started small, a single stall engulfed in flames, but the wind carried it swiftly, turning the square into a chaotic inferno. People screamed and ran, their cries blending with the roar of the flames. Aaron was among the first to arrive, his robe singed as he worked alongside others to douse the fire with buckets of water drawn from the river. In the midst of the chaos, a young boy stood frozen, trapped by the flames. Aaron saw him and acted without hesitation, pushing through the heat and smoke to reach him. The boy's cries of terror were muffled by the roar of the fire, but Aaron's hand found his, pulling him to safety just as the flames consumed the stall behind them. The boy's mother fell to her knees, sobbing as she embraced her child. Aaron stood beside them, coughing from the smoke but alive. The crowd, gathered in the aftermath, watched in silence. Among them was Cale, his face shadowed by conflicting emotions. The fire was eventually extinguished, but its aftermath left the village scarred. Some blamed the faithful for their inaction, others accused Arel's followers of sabotage. The divide widened, trust eroded further. Yet, in the midst of the strife, Aaron's actions lit a small but enduring flame of hope. One day, as Aaron sat beneath the ruins of the Tree of Mirrors, he found himself joined by a small group of children. They asked him to tell them a story, their voices innocent despite the turmoil around them. He smiled, his heart aching for the world they had inherited, and began to speak. He told them of a star that had fallen from the sky, its light dimmed but not extinguished. Though it was no longer in the heavens, it shone brighter than ever on the earth, guiding those who were lost. The star, he said, did not give up its light, even when the darkness seemed endless. The children listened, their eyes wide with wonder. And though the story was simple, its meaning lingered in their hearts, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest times, light could be found. Aaron knew he could not force unity, nor could he erase the pain and anger that divided the village. But he also knew that every act of kindness, every word of truth, was a thread in the unbroken cord. And so, he continued, one step at a time, one word at a time, carrying the light that others might one day follow. The sky darkened at midday, a strange and chilling omen. The sun, once the unchallenged ruler of the heavens, was shrouded in shadow. People gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on the growing eclipse. A cold wind swept through the valley, carrying with it a sense of unease that no one could shake. It was as though the world itself was mourning, and the heavens had turned their back on the earth. In the days leading up to this moment, the cracks in the once harmonious civilization had grown into chasms. Greed festered where generosity had once thrived. Pride replaced humility, and betrayal became a familiar word whispered in the corners of the village. Neighbors who once shared bread now guarded their doors with suspicion. The laughter of children, once so common, was replaced by cries of anger and despair. Elyon, the watcher whose presence had been the guiding light of the village, stood on the edge of the valley, his radiance dimmed. He had not spoken in days, his silence heavy with sorrow. Around him, the other watchers gathered, their forms flickering like dying embers. They had watched, helpless, as the seeds of corruption spread. Their warnings were no longer heeded, their wisdom dismissed as relics of a past no one cared to remember. The great hall, once the heart of the community, now stood empty, its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Inside, the sacred texts lay scattered, their pages torn and trampled. The teachings of the watchers were no longer revered. Instead, they were mocked by those who sought only to satisfy their own desires. The light of faith, once so strong, had been eclipsed by the darkness of selfishness. Arel, the man who had first defied the watchers, now sat atop a throne of his own making. It was a crude thing, carved hastily from the wood of fallen trees, but it carried a symbolic weight that could not be ignored. Around him, a growing band of followers shouted his name, their voices echoing with blind devotion. They called him a liberator, a leader who had freed them from the chains of the divine. But their eyes betrayed a hunger that could not be sated, a yearning for something they could not name. The watchers stood in a silent circle as the first star appeared in the darkened sky. Elyon's voice, when it finally came, was soft and filled with a grief that pierced the hearts of those who still listened. "The balance is broken," he said, his words carrying like the tolling of a distant bell. "We cannot remain." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of faithful who had gathered near the valley's edge. They clung to Elyon's light as a drowning man clings to driftwood, their faces streaked with tears. "You cannot leave us," one woman cried, her voice cracking. "We need you now more than ever." Elyon turned to her, his glowing eyes heavy with sadness. "It is not by our will that we depart, but by the law of the covenant. When the sacred trust is broken, the watchers must retreat. It has always been so." A child stepped forward, her small hand clutching the tattered remains of a sacred text. She looked up at Elyon with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elyon knelt before her, his light flickering as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "There will be a time," he said softly, "a time foretold in the parables. The era of reckoning. On that day, the light and the dark will meet, and the fate of all will be decided." The words hung in the air like a solemn vow, a fragile thread of hope in a world unraveling. But even as he spoke them, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The valley, once a place of harmony and life, seemed to groan under the weight of its own despair. Rivers dried, crops withered, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Arel and his followers stood at a distance, watching as the watchers prepared to leave. He laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "They abandon you," he shouted to the faithful. "Is this the divine justice they promised? They leave you to starve, to suffer, while they retreat to their heavens." The crowd murmured, torn between anger and fear. Some turned away, their faith crumbling under the weight of Arel's words. Others clung to the promise of the watcher's return, their hearts breaking as they watched the divine beings begin to fade. One by one, the watchers stepped into the shadows, their forms dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Elyon was the last to leave, his gaze lingering on the village that had once been a beacon of hope. His light dimmed, and then he was gone. The eclipse reached its peak as the last watcher disappeared. The world was plunged into an unnatural darkness, the sun's absence a stark reminder of what had been lost. In the silence that followed, a single bird's cry pierced the air, a mournful sound that echoed across the valley. Corruption spread like a sickness in the days that followed. Without the Watchers, the village descended into chaos. Factions fought for control, their battles leaving scars on the land and its people. The faithful were driven into hiding, their prayers whispered in secret as they clung to the hope of the era of reckoning. The shadows grew longer, and the light seemed to shrink further with each passing day. But even in the darkest of times, faint glimmers of resistance remained. A small group of scribes worked tirelessly to preserve the teachings of the Watchers, copying the sacred texts by candlelight. Children, too young to understand the weight of what had happened, sang songs of the old ways, their voices carrying a purity that defied the darkness around them. The eclipse lingered in the memories of all who witnessed it, a haunting reminder of the day innocence was lost. The sun would rise again, but it would never shine quite the same. The world had changed, and the Watchers were gone. Yet, in the silence they left behind, their promise echoed, a time would come when the balance would be restored, when light and dark would meet, and the fate of all would be decided. The wind howled through the broken halls of the temple, its mournful cry weaving through the shattered arches and casting flickering shadows against the walls. In the heart of the ruins, a lone figure knelt before a crumbling altar. The woman's hands trembled as she held a scroll, its edges charred, its ink smudged by time and tears. She had found it buried beneath the rubble, tucked away as if someone, long ago, had tried to preserve it from the chaos that consumed the world. The scroll spoke of 7 flames, each one eternal, each a symbol of something forgotten but vital. They were not ordinary flames. They burned not with heat but with a light that pierced the darkness of the soul. It was said that the flames had been scattered across the land, hidden from sight, but that they would burn again when the time was right, when the era of reckoning approached. The woman, Asha, whispered the words aloud, her voice barely rising above the storm outside. The first flame, compassion, flickers in the hearts of those who carry others' burdens. The second, courage, blazes within those who stand against the shadows. The third, wisdom, shines in the seeker of truth. The fourth, patience, smolders quietly in those who endure. The fifth, humility, glows softly in those who bow to the greater good. The sixth, unity, dances in the hands that join as one. And the seventh, hope, burns brightest in the soul that refuses to give in. She stopped, her breath catching. The words seemed to resonate within her, as though the air itself vibrated with their truth. Her eyes lifted to the darkness around her, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint glimmer, a light no brighter than a firefly's glow. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her questioning whether it had been real at all. Outside the temple, the world was fractured and bleeding. Villages lay in ruins, their people divided, their spirits broken. The faithful whispered of the flames, passing the prophecy like a lifeline, though few truly believed it. How could flames endure in a world where light itself had fled? And yet, the story persisted, growing like a fragile sprout in barren soil. Asha wasn't alone in feeling its call. In another part of the land, a boy named Kiran walked the edges of a battlefield, his small frame dwarfed by the remains of toppled walls and burnt-out homes. He had no family left, no name but the one he had given himself. His hands were blistered from digging graves for the nameless, his face streaked with ash and sorrow. One night, as he worked beneath the pale glow of the moon, he uncovered something strange, a shard of glass that seemed to hum with an inner light. He held it up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. It wasn't much, just a shard, but it felt warm in his hand, as if it held a piece of something greater. He didn't know it yet, but that shard was tied to the flame of compassion, a fragment of its light waiting to be found. Far away, in a forest cloaked in mist, an old man named Harun tended to a small fire. His hands were calloused, his back bent with age, but his eyes burned with the sharpness of someone who had lived through too much and learned from all of it. He had heard the prophecy in whispers carried on the wind, and though he had laughed at first, the words had stuck with him. 7 flames, he muttered to himself, feeding the fire with dry twigs. 7 virtues. As if the world ever cared about such things. But even as he scoffed, his hands moved carefully, almost reverently. He knew something was stirring, though he could not name it. That night, as the firelight flickered against the trees, he felt a presence, something unseen but undeniable. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of the flames wash over him. In his dreams, he saw a path illuminated by 7 points of light, leading him to a place he could not yet imagine. The flames were calling to those who needed them most, though none of them fully understood what it meant. Asha, Kiran, Harun, and countless others felt the pull in their own way, their hearts awakening to a purpose that seemed just out of reach. Each flame was more than a symbol, it was a piece of what had been lost, a reminder of the virtues that could heal a broken world. But the path to the flames was not without peril. In the shadows, something stirred, something that hungered for the darkness to remain. It whispered to the lost, the angry, the desperate, offering them power in exchange for their hearts. It whispered to Kale, the hunter who had turned away from Aaron's light, filling his mind with promises of vengeance and strength. And Kale listened, his hands tightening around his blade as he set out to find the flames, not to protect them, but to extinguish them forever. The storm that had begun on the day of the eclipse was growing stronger, sweeping across the land with a ferocity that matched the chaos in the hearts of its people. Yet, amidst the destruction, small lights began to appear. They were faint at first, barely noticeable against the darkness. A mother who shared her last piece of bread with a stranger. A soldier who laid down his weapon to shield a child. A prisoner who forgave his captors. Each act was a spark, and those sparks began to grow. Asha felt it as she wandered the ruins of her village, the scroll tucked close to her chest. Kiran felt it as he carried the shard of glass through fields of ash, his small hands clutching it like a lifeline. Harun felt it as he walked the forest paths, following a light he could not see but trusted all the same. The prophecy of the 7 flames was not just a story, it was a reminder of what humanity could be. It was a challenge to rise above the shadows, to find the light within themselves and protect it, no matter the cost. And though the flames had yet to burn brightly, their presence could already be felt, a quiet promise in a world desperate for hope. The storm raged outside, a tempest unlike any the village had ever seen. Winds howled like wounded beasts, and rain lashed against the rooftops, seeping through cracks and turning the dirt streets into rivers of mud. Inside a small hut at the edge of the village, a woman labored through the night, her cries mingling with the roar of thunder. She clutched the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, as the midwife whispered prayers to the watchers, though none had been seen for generations. Then, at the very moment lightning split the sky, the cries of a newborn echoed through the storm. The midwife held her breath, staring at the child in her hands. His eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed faintly in the dim light of the oil lamp. It wasn't a trick of the storm. The boy's gaze seemed to pierce through the room, through walls, through the very fabric of reality itself. The midwife shivered and crossed herself, muttering, "This is no ordinary child." The villagers were quick to learn of the birth. Word spread faster than the storm could carry it, and by morning, the boy was both a miracle and a curse in their eyes. Some whispered that he was a gift from the heavens, sent to guide them through the darkness. Others muttered of omens and feared that his presence would bring ruin. All agreed on one thing: this child, named Ashan, was different. Ashan grew quickly, his presence as unsettling as it was captivating. By the time he could walk, he spoke with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. His words weren't those of a child, they were parables, riddles wrapped in truths that no one could fully understand. When asked why the river no longer flowed as it once did, he replied, "The river's path was gentle until the stones of pride blocked its way. Only by removing them can the water return." At first, the villagers dismissed his words as the babble of a strange child. But time and time again, his answers proved prophetic. When drought gripped the land, he spoke of digging wells in places where water had long been forgotten. Those who followed his advice struck springs. When disease spread, He whispered of plants that could heal, their names lost to memory until he spoke them. The boy's eyes, still faintly glowing, became a source of both reverence and fear. Mothers brought their sick children to him, hoping for his blessing. Warriors asked for guidance before heading into battle. Yet, just as many kept their distance, whispering that his gaze could see into the darkest corners of their hearts. As Eshan grew, his parables became more enigmatic, touching on the divine. He spoke of the watchers who had left, and of a time when they would return. The stars watch the earth, he said one night, his voice soft but unwavering. They wait for us to learn what was forgotten. But not all will listen, and not all will remain when the stars descend. His words stirred both awe and unease. The faithful began calling him the seer, while others whispered that he was a danger to the fragile balance of their world. Elders debated whether to embrace him or banish him. They feared that his insight came at a cost they could not yet see. One day, a stranger arrived in the village, a wanderer cloaked in tattered robes. His face was lined with years of hardship, but his eyes burned with a fervor that matched Eshan's. He approached the boy, kneeling before him, and said, "I have heard of you, child. I have walked this earth searching for truth, and I believe you hold it. Tell me, what must I do to find peace?" Eshan stared at the man for a long time, his glowing eyes unblinking. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the crowd gathering around them. "Peace is not found," he said. "It is made. But to make it, you must first unmake the chains you wear." The man wept, his tears falling freely into the dust. The villagers watched, some moved, others skeptical. What chains? They wondered. What did the boy see that they could not? It wasn't long before others began to come. Travelers, outcasts, and seekers from faraway lands journeyed to the village to hear the seer's words. Some returned with renewed purpose, others with despair. His parables were not promises, they were mirrors, reflecting truths that people were often unwilling to face. But the growing attention brought danger. The lords of the land, fearful of anything that challenged their power, began to take notice. Rumors of the seer reached their ears, stories of a boy who could see into the souls of men, who spoke of a reckoning that would tear the world apart and rebuild it anew. They sent soldiers to the village, demanding that Eshan be brought to them. The villagers were divided. Some argued that giving him up would spare them the wrath of the lords. Others insisted that he was their hope, their guide in a world teetering on the edge of ruin. Eshan himself stood silently as they argued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When the soldiers came, they found him sitting at the edge of the village, waiting. "Do you not fear us?" one of them asked, his voice gruff but tinged with uncertainty. Eshan looked up at him, his glowing eyes steady. "Fear blinds the heart," he said. "I do not fear you, but I pity the weight you carry." The soldier faltered, his hand lowering from the hilt of his sword. For a moment, it seemed as though the boy had disarmed him not with weapons, but with words. But the moment passed, and the soldiers took him away, leaving the villagers in stunned silence. What happened to him after that is a story told in fragments, in whispers carried across the land. Some say he was imprisoned, his light extinguished by those who feared it. Others believe he escaped, continuing to speak his parables to those who would listen. And still others claim that he vanished entirely, his final words echoing like a prophecy, "The flames will rise. The stars will fall. And the truth will burn away the shadows." The villagers were left to grapple with what they had witnessed. Whether they feared or revered him, none could deny that the seer had changed them. His parables lingered, haunting their thoughts and shaping their choices in ways they could not fully understand. And somewhere, perhaps far from where he was born, Eshan looked to the sky, his glowing eyes reflecting the light of the stars. Beneath a sky bruised with storms, a man stood at the edge of a jagged cliff. His face, half lit by flashes of distant lightning, was a mask of defiance. Below him, the valley stretched like a wound, its rivers turned to poison and its trees stripped bare. His name was Kale, and his voice carried across the abyss like a challenge. If the heavens will not answer us, then we will build our own. The crowd gathered behind him erupted in cheers, their faces alight with something darker than hope. They had suffered too long, endured too much. Their faith had turned to ash, and in its place grew a hunger for power, for freedom without chains, for a new order where they were beholden to nothing and no one. Kale, once a soldier who had knelt before the Watchers, was now their fiercest opponent. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his soul, waiting for salvation that never came. In his anger, he had turned to the shadows, seeking not comfort but strength. The divine order has failed us, he declared. If righteousness means submission, then I reject it. If virtue means weakness, then I will create my own law. He wasn't alone. Across the fractured lands, others like him began to rise. They called themselves the Forsaken, though the name was less an admission of abandonment and more a badge of pride. They reveled in their rebellion, crafting philosophies that twisted the virtues of old into weapons of their own making. In their creed, compassion was weakness, a tool to control the strong. Greed became ambition, a force to claim what one deserved. Pride was no longer a sin but a beacon of self-worth, a declaration of existence in a world that had sought to erase them. They spoke of betrayal as liberation, patience as cowardice, and unity as a shackle. And hope. Hope was for the naive. They crafted their symbols, marks burned into flesh, sigils painted in blood, each one representing a virtue turned on its head. A clenched fist for strength through dominance. An eye surrounded by flames for the wisdom to destroy illusions. A twisted tree for growth at any cost, even if it meant uprooting everything else. But their rebellion was not without cost. Where they went, chaos followed. Towns fell under their influence, their laws rewritten overnight. Those who resisted were cast out, their cries swallowed by the darkness. Yet, even as the Forsaken's power grew, whispers of doubt began to stir among them. Not all who joined their cause did so out of belief. Some were desperate, drawn by the promise of safety in a world that no longer made sense. Others saw the Forsaken as a means to an end, a way to channel their anger without thought of consequence. And still, others clung to fragments of their old selves, haunted by memories of a time when they had believed in something greater. One night, Kale sat alone in a ruined temple, its walls etched with prayers long since forgotten. He stared at the shattered altar before him, his fist tightening around the hilt of his blade. He had convinced himself that the Watchers were dead, that their silence was proof of their absence. Yet, in the stillness of the night, doubt gnawed at him. What if they were watching? What if their silence was not absence but judgment? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A woman emerged from the shadows, her face partially hidden by a hood. She was one of his lieutenants, a sharp-eyed fighter named Myra. "You called for me," she said, her voice steady but questioning. Kale didn't look at her. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his tone bitter, "if we've become the very thing we swore to destroy?" Myra hesitated. "We've become what we had to be," she replied. "The world gave us no choice." He turned to her then, his eyes dark. "There's always a choice. That's what they used to say, isn't it? The Watchers, with their parables and riddles. But what choice did they give us when they left us to rot?" Myra didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've given us something to believe in, Kale. That's more than they ever did." Her words seemed to soothe him, but only for a moment. As she left, Kale's gaze returned to the altar. In its center, half buried beneath the rubble, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint glow, barely perceptible in the darkness. His breath caught, and for a moment, fear crept into his defiance. Across the land, similar moments played out among the Forsaken. In their rebellion, they had sought to tear down the old ways, yet echoes of the divine persisted. A man who had carved the sigil of ambition into his chest paused as he passed a dying child on the road. Against his own creed, he stopped to help, the child's gratitude piercing the armor he had built around his heart. A woman who preached dominance wept in secret as she buried the last of her family, the pain of her loss undermining the philosophy she had adopted to survive. The path of sin was not as simple as they had imagined. For every act of rebellion, there was a moment of doubt. For every twisted philosophy, a lingering memory of what had been lost. And for every triumph, a shadow of regret. Yet, the Forsaken pressed on, their leaders growing bolder, their influence spreading like wildfire. They believed themselves unstoppable, a force destined to reshape the world in their image. But in their arrogance, they failed to see the fractures forming within their ranks. Greed turned allies into rivals. Pride bred betrayal. And beneath it all, a quiet fear began to grow, the fear that they were wrong. Cale felt it most of all, though he buried it deep within him. He had built his rebellion on the ashes of faith, yet the embers refused to die. They flickered in the edges of his mind, in the words of those he had cast aside, in the faint glow of the shattered altar that haunted his dreams. The sinner's path was one of power, of defiance, of freedom without restraint. But it was also a path of isolation, of conflict, of wounds that never healed. It was a path that led them ever further from the light, yet never fully extinguished its memory. For even in the darkest hearts, a spark remained, waiting for the moment when it might burn again. A sky choked with ash and fire stretched above the city of shadows. Its towers, like skeletal fingers, reached toward the heavens in defiance, their edges jagged and gleaming with blackened glass. Rivers of molten light coursed through the streets below, not born of nature but of human craft, brilliant, dangerous, untamed. From afar, the city was a monument to ingenuity. Up close, it was a labyrinth of despair. The air buzzed with an unsettling energy, a mix of ambition and ruin. Merchants in cloaks of shimmering silver bartered goods laced with hidden curses. Their stalls lined streets carved from obsidian, where shadows clung to the edges as if afraid to venture too far. Children with hollow eyes darted between alleyways, their laughter sharp and echoing, like ghosts replaying memories of joy they no longer understood. This was a place where virtue had been twisted into something unrecognizable. A city built not with care, but with greed, not for shelter, but for power. Its foundations were the bones of trust, long since crushed beneath the weight of its ambition. At the city's heart stood a palace, its spires coiled with veins of gold. Inside, the rulers of this shadowed haven debated, schemed, and betrayed one another under the guise of progress. Cale, the leader of the Forsaken, had declared it a sanctuary. Here, he had proclaimed, standing on the grand steps of the palace, "We are free. Free from the chains of morality that the Watchers sought to bind us with. Free to shape our destiny as we see fit." His voice had carried through the crowd like a battle cry, igniting a frenzy of cheers. Yet, even as they celebrated, some among them hesitated. The city was a marvel, yes, but its beauty was cold, its brilliance cruel. Beneath the gleaming surface, a rot festered, a hunger that could never be satisfied. In the grand halls of the palace, mirrors lined the walls, each one reflecting a distorted image of those who passed. A merchant paused to gaze at his reflection, only to see his face hollowed and eyes sunken, as if the mirror had peered into his soul. He turned away quickly, pulling his cloak tighter around him, but the image stayed with him, a whisper of a truth he dared not confront. The streets below were alive with activity, but it was a life stripped of warmth. A woman sold vials of liquid that promised eternal youth, though she herself bore the scars of its lies. A man preached from a high platform, his voice filled with fire as he condemned the weak and glorified the strong, while coins poured into the box at his feet. Around them, the people moved like shadows, their faces a mix of awe and despair. In one corner of the city, a boy crouched beside a fountain, its water black and shimmering like oil. He dipped his fingers in cautiously, marveling at how it glistened on his skin. A moment later, he cried out as the liquid burned him, the pain sharp and searing. His mother pulled him away, scolding him not for his curiosity but for his weakness. "You must be stronger," she hissed, her voice trembling. "This city does not forgive the fragile." At night, the city transformed. The molten rivers cast an eerie glow, painting the streets in hues of gold and crimson. Shadows danced along the walls, moving as if alive. From the palace, the laughter of the elite echoed through the city, a sound both alluring and sinister. They feasted on delicacies brought from the far corners of the world, their tables laden with riches stolen from those who dared to hope for a better life. And yet, even in their indulgence, they were restless. No matter how much they consumed, it was never enough. The city was a paradox. It celebrated freedom but thrived on control. It claimed to reject morality but created its own twisted code. Trust was a currency too rare to spend, and loyalty was a weapon wielded by the cunning. Those who thrived here were not the strongest or the smartest, but the ones willing to abandon the last remnants of their humanity. One night, a storm rolled in, its winds howling like the cries of the forgotten. Lightning illuminated the city in brief, blinding flashes, revealing cracks in its once pristine facade. A young woman stood on a balcony, her hands gripping the edge as the storm tore at her cloak. Her name was Elora, and she had come to the city seeking freedom, only to find herself bound by new chains. Below her, the streets writhed with chaos. Merchants scrambled to protect their wares as the wind threatened to scatter them. A fight broke out near the fountain, two men clawing at each other over a piece of bread. In the distance, a building collapsed, its walls no match for the storm. Elora watched it all with a mixture of anger and sorrow. This was not the city she had dreamed of. This was not the life she had hoped for. As the storm raged on, she turned her gaze to the palace. Its spires stood defiant against the winds, their golden veins gleaming even in the darkness. She thought of Kale, the man who had inspired her to leave her old life behind. She had believed in his vision, in his promise of a world unbound by the rules of the Watchers. But now, she wondered if he had led them all astray. In the palace, Kale sat in the grand chamber, his eyes fixed on the storm outside. The mirrors around him reflected his image, fractured and distorted. He was surrounded by his followers, their voices a cacophony of demands and accusations. Yet, for all their noise, he felt utterly alone. The city of shadows was his creation, a testament to his rebellion. But as he gazed at its crumbling streets and its people consumed by greed, he felt a pang of doubt. Was this what freedom looked like? Was this what he had fought for? As the storm began to subside, the city fell into an uneasy silence. The molten rivers still flowed, their light casting long, flickering shadows. The people returned to their lives, their faces weary but determined. In the distance, a child's laughter broke through the quiet, a sound so pure it seemed out of place. Kale heard it from the palace, and for a moment, it pierced through the darkness in his heart. But the moment passed, and the city continued its relentless march toward its own destruction. It was a haven for the wicked, a marvel of human ingenuity corrupted by greed. And yet, beneath its gleaming surface, a question lingered, unspoken but undeniable: how long could it stand before it consumed itself entirely? The prophet stood on a ridge overlooking the barren expanse, their voice steady yet tinged with sorrow. The wasteland stretched endlessly before them, a desolation so profound that it seemed to consume all sound, all light. The ground was cracked and lifeless, its color a dull gray as if it had forgotten the vibrancy of life. The wind howled, carrying with it the bitter scent of decay, and the horizon shimmered with the mirage of a world that once was. They began the tale with a whisper, their words carried by the wind to the ears of those who gathered below. There was a land, they said, where the soil was fertile, the rivers abundant, and the air filled with the songs of birds. Its people flourished, for they lived in harmony with one another and the gifts of the earth. The crowd listened, their faces etched with the weight of their own guilt. The prophet's words felt like a mirror, reflecting not only the world around them but the hollowness within their own hearts. The tale wove itself into their minds, vivid and unrelenting. This land, the prophet continued, was entrusted to its people, who were given wisdom by those who came before them. They were warned of the balance that must be kept, of the need to give as much as they took, to honor the life that sustained them. The wind picked up, swirling dust into the air, as if the wasteland itself protested the story being told. But, the prophet's voice grew sharper, they grew blind to their blessings. They took and took, digging deeper into the earth, cutting down the forests, and damming the rivers to serve their desires. Their hunger grew insatiable, and the gifts they had been given became burdens in their hands. A child in the crowd clung to their mother's side, their wide eyes fixed on the prophet. The story seemed almost too vivid, too close to the truth. The prophet noticed and softened their tone, though the weight of their words remained. The land began to change. The rivers, once so clear, turned murky and choked with debris. The forests, homes to countless creatures, fell silent as their guardians were driven away. The air grew heavy, suffocating those who breathed it. Yet, the people refused to see. They built monuments to their ambition, towering structures of stone and metal, even as the earth crumbled beneath them. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind's mournful cry. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. She had seen this story play out in her own life, her own choices. And then, the prophet said, their voice dropping to a whisper, came the flames. The crowd stirred uneasily, their faces pale. The skies darkened as fires consumed the land. The rivers dried up, their beds cracked and lifeless. The people, so consumed by their greed, turned on one another, fighting over the scraps that remained. They had forgotten their unity, their shared bond with the land, and so they perished, alone and afraid. A man stepped forward, his voice thick with desperation. "Is there no hope?" he asked, his words heavy with the unspoken plea for redemption. The prophet turned to him, their gaze piercing yet kind. "Hope," they said, "lies in the lessons of the past. This wasteland," they gestured to the desolation before them, "is a testament to what happens when we forget our place, when we let our greed consume us. But even in the ashes, seeds can be planted." The tale continued, delving into the aftermath of the ruin. The people of the land, those few who had survived, wandered aimlessly through the wasteland. Their bodies were frail, their spirits broken. Yet, within their suffering, there was a glimmer of understanding. They began to gather the remnants of what they had destroyed, broken branches, seeds buried deep in the scorched earth, fragments of memories whispered through the wind. They learned, the prophet said, that to rebuild, they must first atone. They began to care for the land, not as masters, but as stewards. They worked together, sharing what little they had, their hands calloused but their hearts softened. And though the land was slow to heal, it did begin to change. Green shoots appeared in the cracks of the earth, rivers began to trickle once more, and the air carried the faintest scent of blossoms. The prophet's voice faltered, their own emotions catching up to them. The story was not just a tale, it was a warning, a plea, a call to action. They looked out at the crowd, their eyes brimming with unspoken truths. "This wasteland," they said, "is not just a place. It is the reflection of our choices, our actions. It is the world we leave behind for those who come after us." The people stood in silence, their minds grappling with the weight of the parable. The wasteland before them no longer seemed distant or abstract. It was their own world, their own lives, laid bare. In the distance, the wind carried a faint sound, a bird's call, delicate and fleeting. It was a sound that had not been heard in the wasteland for generations. The prophet smiled faintly, their gaze fixed on the horizon. They said nothing more, but the tale lingered in the air, a living thing that refused to be forgotten. The crowd began to disperse, each person carrying the weight of the parable with them. The child clutched their mother's hand tightly, their steps hesitant but filled with newfound determination. The man who had spoken earlier stared at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. And the woman who had wiped her tears gazed at the cracked earth beneath her feet, a seed of hope planted deep within her heart. The wasteland remained, vast and unyielding. But within it, amidst the desolation, there was a whisper of change, a promise that, though fragile, could grow into something new. The prophet watched the people leave, their face serene yet somber. They knew the path ahead would be long, but the first steps had been taken. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat seem loud. People paused in their tasks, looking skyward as the light began to shift. It was subtle at first, the sun taking on an odd, golden hue as though it had caught fire within. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth and the farthest reaches of the heavens. It wasn't a sound that could be ignored, it demanded attention, silencing all murmurs, all motion. Every head turned as the hum grew into a haunting melody, ancient and commanding. The horizon rippled, the air shimmering like water disturbed by a stone. Slowly, a figure emerged, descending from the sky with a brilliance that defied understanding. They were cloaked in light, a cascade of shifting colors that seemed to hold the secrets of creation itself. Their face was obscured, but their presence was overwhelming, an undeniable force that made the bravest souls tremble and the most skeptical fall to their knees. The figure hovered just above the ground, their feet never touching the earth. Around them, the very air seemed to sing, vibrating with an energy that made the hair on people's arms stand on end. They raised a hand, and the hum fell silent. It was the kind of silence that held the weight of something about to happen, something that would change everything. The figure's voice rang out, not in a language anyone knew, but in a way that every heart understood. It wasn't speech, it was truth, carried on a tide of sound and light that broke against the walls people had built within themselves. Some wept openly, clutching their chests as if the words had pierced through to their very souls. Others cowered, as though afraid of being seen too clearly. "This is the beginning," the voice intoned, echoing through the hearts of all who heard it. It wasn't loud, yet it carried the power of 1,000 storms. The time has come for the scales to tip, for deeds to find their weight. The first parable is written in the choices you have made. The second begins now. The crowd grew restless, unease spreading like a shadow. A child clung to their parent, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The figure turned toward the child, their radiance softening for a moment. It was as though they saw everything in that gaze, the innocence, the fear, the flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. Then, with a sweep of their arm, the figure gestured toward the land. Where once the ground was barren and lifeless, a glowing line appeared, stretching far into the distance. It split the earth in two, a luminous divide that seemed to pulse with life on one side and a chilling void on the other. The people murmured, unsure of what they were witnessing, yet unable to look away. "Step forward," the voice commanded, gentle yet unyielding. The words carried a weight that made hesitation impossible. Slowly, hesitantly, a man emerged from the crowd, his hands trembling. He approached the divide, his eyes darting between the glowing path and the void. The figure regarded him, and for a moment, it seemed as though time stood still. "You carry the burden of your choices," the figure said, their voice softer now, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Your heart speaks louder than your words. Step, and let the truth be revealed." The man's breath hitched, and his face twisted with anguish. He glanced back at the crowd, seeking reassurance, but none came. With a deep, shuddering breath, he stepped forward, crossing the line into the glow. As he did, the light enveloped him, wrapping around his form like a cocoon. His face softened, the fear melting away into something that looked like peace. He turned back to the crowd, his expression serene, before vanishing into the light. The people gasped, their reactions a mixture of relief and dread. For every step into the light, there was the possibility of another into the void. The figure turned to the crowd again, their gaze sweeping over the faces filled with guilt, defiance, and hope. Another figure emerged from the crowd, a woman this time, her head held high. She walked with a defiant air, as though daring the celestial figure to judge her. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the divide, and for a moment, the crowd held its breath. She stepped forward, but the glow recoiled from her, leaving her standing in shadow. The void surged forward, wrapping around her ankles and pulling her in. Her scream echoed long after she had disappeared, a chilling reminder of the stakes at hand. The celestial figure's light flickered, as though mourning the loss, but their voice remained steady. Every heart is known. Every deed remembered. This is the reckoning. The crowd shifted uneasily, the weight of their own choices pressing down on them. For some, it was the guilt of wrongs left unrighted. For others, it was the realization that they had clung to their righteousness, not out of faith, but out of pride. The line glowed brighter, as if sensing the turmoil in their hearts. A child stepped forward, their small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the moment. They looked up at the celestial figure, their eyes wide with innocence and curiosity. The figure knelt slightly, their radiance dimming as if to meet the child on their level. The child reached out, their tiny hand brushing against the light. It enveloped them immediately, lifting them gently and carrying them across the divide into the glow. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their hearts aching at the purity of the moment. One by one, people stepped forward. Each decision carried the weight of a lifetime, the balance of choices tipping one way or the other. The celestial figure stood unwavering, their presence a constant reminder of the inevitability of judgment. For some, the glow was a promise of renewal, of peace. For others, the void was a stark reflection of the darkness they had allowed to grow within. The scene unfolded like a living parable, each step a testament to the complexities of the human soul. The celestial figure never wavered, their light neither condemning nor forgiving, only revealing. And as the line stretched endlessly before them, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The reckoning had come, and with it, the second parable began to write itself in the choices of those who stood before the divide. The room was vast, stretching farther than the eye could see, yet it felt suffocatingly close. The air shimmered, heavy with an energy that seemed to pierce through the skin and into the soul. In the center of this boundless space stood a single, radiant scale. It glowed softly, exuding an ancient, unyielding presence. It wasn't made of gold or any earthly material but something beyond comprehension, a substance that seemed to ripple with the essence of time itself. Around the scale, a silent crowd stood frozen, their faces pale with dread and wonder. Each soul was called forward, drawn by an invisible force. No words were spoken, yet the call was undeniable, reverberating in the chest like a distant drumbeat. When the first soul stepped into the circle of light surrounding the scale, the room seemed to hold its breath. Their steps were tentative, their shoulders trembling under the weight of an unseen burden. Before them, the scale began to shift, its two plates hanging in perfect stillness, awaiting judgment. On one plate, a feather appeared, delicate and glowing, a fragment of purity and truth. On the other, darkness began to gather, twisting and swirling, a living shadow that pulsed with every unkind word, every selfish act, every choice that had tipped the balance toward despair. The souls stood in silence, their hands clenched into fists. There was no defense to be made, no voice to plead their case. The scale responded only to the truth. The feather trembled, its glow intensifying as if fighting against the oppressive weight of the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as though the feather might prevail, but then the shadows surged forward, heavier, denser, swallowing the light. A low, mournful tone echoed through the space, and the soul fell to their knees. The void yawned open beneath them, a swirling abyss that stretched endlessly downward. It wasn't the absence of light, but the presence of something darker, colder, hungrier than anything the soul could have imagined. The figure screamed, their voice breaking into sobs as they were pulled downward, vanishing into the nothingness. The room remained silent, the crowd motionless, yet the air felt charged with unspoken fears. The scale reset itself, the plates returning to their poised equilibrium. The next soul was called, and then the next, each one stepping forward to face the unyielding truth of their lives. Then came a woman, her face lined with the marks of a hard but honest life. Her steps were steady, her gaze unwavering as she approached the scale. The feather appeared, glowing fiercely, and the darkness swirled, seeking to gain purchase. But this time, the feather grew brighter, lifting the darkness until it began to dissipate, piece by piece. The scale tipped toward the light, and the room was filled with a resonant chime that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the universe. From above, a beam of pure light descended, enveloping the woman. Her face softened, tears streaming down her cheeks as she rose, lifted gently upward. Her form shimmered as she was carried higher, vanishing into the radiance of the halls of eternal light. The crowd stirred, some weeping openly, others bowing their heads in reverence. One by one, the souls came forward. Some bore the unbearable weight of their sins, their forms hunched as though the air itself had turned against them. Others stepped forward with calm resolve, their hearts unburdened by guilt. For each, the scale rendered its judgment without malice or mercy, its glow unwavering. As the trial continued, the celestial figure who had summoned the reckoning watched in silence, their form towering over the assembly. Their presence was a constant reminder of the higher order at play, of the unchangeable truth that governed all existence. Though they said nothing, their gaze seemed to pierce through each soul, seeing beyond the facade of flesh and into the essence of what lay within. The room began to shift, the walls rippling like water as the balance of the crowd changed. With every soul lifted into the light, the space grew warmer, brighter. But with every soul cast into the void, the shadows deepened, creeping closer to the edges of the light. It was a battle as old as time, waged in silence, yet felt in every breath, every heartbeat. A child stepped forward next, their small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the scale. The crowd gasped, their whispers filling the air like the rustle of leaves. The child's eyes were wide but unafraid, their gaze fixed on the celestial figure. The feather appeared, its glow delicate but unwavering. The shadows stirred but did not gather. Instead, they dissipated, as though the innocence of the child left no space for them to grow. The scale tipped effortlessly toward the light, and the chime rang out once more. The beam descended, softer this time, as though cradling the child as they ascended. Their small face lit up with joy, a pure, untainted smile that lingered in the hearts of those who watched. The crowd shifted again, their unease growing as the line grew shorter. Those who remained were no longer faceless, their deeds clung to them like a second skin, visible in every twitch of their hands, every flicker of their eyes. They knew what awaited them, yet they could not turn away. Among them stood an old man, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years. His face was worn, his eyes tired, yet there was something in his expression that spoke of regret and yearning. When his turn came, he stepped forward slowly, his breath labored but steady. The scale hesitated, as though wrestling with the complexity of his soul. The feather glowed faintly, while the darkness surged and retreated, unable to fully claim him. For what felt like an eternity, the scale wavered, its plates trembling. Finally, it tipped toward the light, though not by much. The chime rang out, softer this time, as if acknowledging the frailty of his redemption. The man wept openly as the beam of light enveloped him, his form lifting slowly. His face turned upward, a mixture of relief and sorrow etched into his features. As he ascended, the light seemed to cleanse him, leaving behind only the essence of what he could have been. And so the trial continued, each soul standing before the scale to face the unrelenting weight of their choices. For every heart judged, the balance of the universe seemed to shift, the eternal struggle between light and darkness playing out in the most personal of ways. The air was thick with a coldness that seemed to seep into every pore, chilling the bones and freezing the very breath in one's lungs. No sound could be heard, save for the soft echo of footsteps that never seemed to lead anywhere. A vast, desolate hall stretched endlessly in all directions, walls lined with mirrors, hundreds, thousands, maybe more, each one shimmering with a reflection of something that wasn't quite right. The mirrors weren't just reflective surfaces. They were alive, alive with memories, alive with sins, alive with shadows. The first sinner stepped forward, their feet heavy, dragging as though the weight of their guilt was too much to bear. They looked around, confusion flickering in their eyes, but the mirrors were everywhere, watching, waiting. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, they approached the nearest reflection. At first, it seemed like any other mirror, a perfect surface, clear and unblemished. But when the sinner peered closer, their own face twisted, shifting in ways that felt unnatural. It wasn't the face they remembered, but a face marked with cruelty, with hatred, with every wicked thought they had ever entertained. The reflection sneered at them. It wasn't them, but it was. It was their corruption, their sins made flesh, staring back with a mocking grin. The sinner recoiled, but the reflection followed their every move, as though mocking their retreat. It was a cruel game, and they were the plaything. Desperately, they turned, only to find another mirror just as unforgiving. This time, it was a scene from their past, a moment when they had betrayed a friend, a loved one. They watched themselves lying, saw the anguish on the other's face, the trust they had shattered with a single, careless word. They closed their eyes, but the reflection remained. In the mirrors, the betrayal was a never-ending loop, repeating itself over and over, never allowing them to forget. They tried to scream, but no sound left their throat. The weight of their choices pressed down harder, suffocating, relentless. The sinner tried to turn away again, but each mirror seemed to lead them deeper into the maze, a labyrinth of endless reflections. With every step they took, a new image appeared, each one more damning than the last. The darkness within them twisted and grew, feeding off the torment the mirrors reflected back at them. They were trapped in their own actions, unable to escape the suffocating grip of their past. A mirror on the far side of the hall caught their attention. The reflection was different this time. It wasn't their face that stared back at them, but the face of someone they had destroyed. The person's eyes were empty, hollow, but they were locked onto the sinner's with a deep, unspoken pain. The sinner staggered toward it, reaching out with trembling hands, as if the touch might somehow undo the damage. But as their fingers grazed the surface, the reflection shifted, morphing into another scene, a new torment. The person they had wronged now stood before them, but they were not the same. They were broken, disfigured, their bodies scarred by the very sins the sinner had committed. It was as though the mirror itself was feeding off their shame, and with every passing moment, it grew darker, more twisted. The sinner's heart pounded in their chest, the fear rising like a choking wave. They wanted to run, to escape, but every path led to more mirrors, more horrors. They were trapped in a place where time no longer existed, where they were bound to relive the worst parts of themselves over and over again. As the sinner's vision blurred, the mirrors seemed to multiply, filling the space with reflections of their darkest desires, their deepest regrets. The images shifted constantly, each mirror reflecting a different part of them. Their selfishness. Their pride. Their greed. The reflection in each one grew worse, darker, uglier, until the sinner no longer recognized themselves. Every flicker of guilt, every tiny crack in their soul was now magnified and distorted, all-consuming. It was an endless cycle, a punishment so cruel that it felt as if time itself had stopped, leaving the sinner forever locked in this prison of their own making. No rest. No escape. No mercy. And yet, as the sinner stood there, trembling, helpless, a whisper seemed to rise from the very walls. It was soft at first, just a faint murmur, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. The voices of those they had harmed echoed in their ears, repeating the same words over and over again, asterisk, why? Asterisk, asterisk, why did you? Asterisk, asterisk, why did you leave me? Asterisk, the guilt was unbearable, like a weight pressing down on their chest, suffocating them. The mirrors flashed faster now, their images a blur of pain, regret, and sorrow. They wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words were trapped in their throat. Every time they tried, the mirrors only deepened the void, the abyss that had been created within them. The sinner fell to their knees, the weight of their actions crushing them from all sides. They were nothing but a shadow now, a hollow shell of the person they once were. And still, the mirrors mocked them, each one reflecting their failure, their choices, their corruption. There was no end to it. There was no escape from what they had done. With each reflection, they were further pulled into the cycle of their own despair. They had become a part of it, a fixture in the endless hall of mirrors, forever reliving the worst of themselves. And then, in the deepest corner of the hall, there was a faint glimmer of light. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The sinner's heart quickened, a flicker of hope stirring within them. Could it be possible? Could there be redemption? They tried to move toward it, but their legs were weak, their body unresponsive. Every step they took felt like it cost them more than they had left to give. The light beckoned, but the mirrors closed in around them, pulling them back, forcing them to confront their failures once again. They reached out toward the light, but the mirrors shattered, and in the instant they did, the world around them twisted into something worse. The light flickered and died, leaving only the endless void, the endless torment. The sinner cried out, but there was no one to hear. Only the mirrors remained, silent, relentless, reflecting the darkness that had consumed them. And so, the cycle began again. The light was soft, gentle, like the first rays of dawn after a long night. The air seemed lighter here, as if it carried the weight of nothing, no guilt, no pain, no regrets. It was a peace that settled over the soul like a warm blanket, the kind that makes you feel safe, at home, after a lifetime of storms. The righteous walked quietly, not in haste, but with a calm certainty that spoke of knowing exactly where they were headed. There were no mirrors here. No endless maze of guilt or torment. The path was straight, clear, and bathed in a warm, golden glow that seemed to pulse with life itself. With every step, the ground beneath them seemed to hum with a quiet, welcoming rhythm, as if the earth itself was glad to support them. They did not need to look around, for they knew they were not alone. The presence of something far greater than themselves wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, guiding them, protecting them. There was no fear here, only peace. A peace so pure, so complete, that it made their hearts swell with an emotion they could barely put into words. They walked together, hand in hand, their faces serene, their hearts light. They had done nothing extraordinary in their lives, at least not by the standards of others. They had simply lived with kindness, with humility, with love. They had seen the brokenness in the world but chose to heal it, one small act at a time. And now, they were walking into a place where that goodness was their reward. Ahead of them, a soft glow grew brighter, pulling them forward like a magnetic force. As they moved closer, the light became overwhelming, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that made every inch of their being feel alive, alive in a way they had never felt before. They were not walking towards something. No, they were being called into something. Into something vast, something beyond time, beyond comprehension. It was a place of unity, a place where every soul was at peace, bound together not by obligation but by love. The righteous did not stumble. They did not hesitate. With every step, the light grew, swirling around them in radiant colors, shifting like a living thing, like a dream come to life. The closer they came to the source of the light, the more they felt a deep sense of belonging, as though the very essence of who they were was woven into the fabric of this place. It was a homecoming, a reunion with something ancient, something eternal. And as they stepped into the light, they felt it, the divine presence, enveloping them like a warm embrace, welcoming them into the fold of something far greater than themselves. It was as if every part of their soul had been preparing for this moment, preparing for this peace. They were no longer weighed down by the struggles of the world. No longer burdened by the choices they had made, for here, there was only grace. In the distance, a figure stood waiting. It was not a person, not a being with a name, but a presence. A presence so immense that it filled every corner of the space, yet it felt intimately close, as if this presence had always been there, right beside them, guiding them, waiting for them to finally arrive. It was the divine, the source of all love, all light, all peace. And when the righteous reached this presence, they did not need words. There was no need for explanation, no need for praise. They were simply known, every part of them, from the smallest kindness to the deepest sorrow. All was understood. All was forgiven. All was made whole. The righteous did not fall to their knees. There was no need for reverence here. No need for fear. They stood tall, shoulder to shoulder with the divine presence, their hearts open, their souls at peace. And the divine embraced them, not with grandeur or ceremony, but with a deep, knowing love that spoke without words. It was a love so complete, so pure, that it left no room for doubt. No room for fear. It was a love that made them feel whole, as though every broken piece of their past had been healed in an instant. The path stretched before them, endless, not in a way that was daunting, but in a way that promised peace forever. There were no more battles to fight, no more pain to endure. Only the sweet, eternal serenity of this place. They had earned it. They had lived with compassion, with humility, with a selfless love that transcended everything the world had tried to teach them. And as they walked forward, side by side, they were not alone. There were others. Many others. Souls who had walked the same path, who had shared in the same trials, who had been as flawed as they were, but had chosen to rise above it. Together, they moved forward, their hearts beating in unison, as one. There was no fear, no jealousy, no greed here. Only love. A love that connected them all, binding them not just to each other, but to something greater than themselves. Something eternal. As they ascended into the heart of this divine peace, they felt themselves becoming part of it, merging with the very essence of this place. They were not lost. They were found. Found in a way they had never known before. Found in a way that made all the struggles of their past seem small, insignificant, when compared to the infinite beauty of this moment. They were home. And here, in this place, they would remain forever, embraced by the divine, in peace, in unity, in eternal love. Two rivers flowed side by side, but they couldn't have been more different. One was calm, its waters glimmering under a soft, golden light that seemed to pour down from the sky itself. The river of light moved gently, its waters smooth and welcoming. A place where every ripple seemed to whisper of peace, of warmth, of safety. Anyone who entered its embrace felt the weight of their burdens lighten, felt the heaviness in their heart lift. It was a river that promised renewal, a second chance for those who sought it. The other river was wild, its waters burning with a fierce, angry heat. The fire river roared as it surged forward, relentless and unforgiving. Its surface was covered in streaks of molten orange and red, and its heat could scorch the soul just by being near it. No one could approach without feeling the searing pain of its flames, the sting of its unyielding justice. This river didn't care for mercy, it gave only what it had, retribution, punishment, and a harsh reckoning. The two rivers were not far apart, but they seemed to exist in two completely different worlds. People stood at the banks, gazing at both, their eyes reflecting uncertainty and fear. The question lingered in their hearts, which river would they cross? The first river, the river of light, called out to them with a gentle song. It promised peace, promised an escape from the shadows that haunted their hearts. Its waters sparkled, as though inviting them to step in, to be cleansed of all the mistakes they had ever made. It was a soothing invitation, one that promised a journey toward healing, toward becoming whole again. But even as they stood on the edge, ready to step in, some hesitated. They had heard stories of those who tried to cross this river, only to fail, only to slip, to fall back into darkness. The other river, the river of fire, was a stark contrast. Its voice was not sweet, but loud, like the thunderous roar of a storm. It did not call out gently. It shouted for those who felt they deserved punishment, for those who sought justice. Its flames crackled as if it knew no mercy. The river of fire had a way of pulling people in, its heat so overwhelming that those who feared the river of light would sometimes choose the burning path, thinking the fire might cleanse them, might pay for their sins in a way that felt earned. The fire offered no promises of peace, only retribution. But it wasn't that simple. Not for everyone. There were those who stood on the banks of the fire river, watching it with fear, knowing they had crossed lines, made mistakes so deep that they thought they could never escape. They felt as if they deserved nothing less than the heat, the burn of the flames that would mark them forever. The fire would scorch them, yes, but perhaps, in its fire, they could find the absolution they so desperately sought. Yet, what none of them realized was that the two rivers were not simply places to end up, they were paths to walk, choices to make. It wasn't the river itself that decided the fate of the soul. No, it was the journey that mattered. One person stepped forward, not towards the river of light, but towards the fire. With each step, the air seemed to grow hotter, the ground beneath them growing rough, as if the earth itself protested their choice. They wavered, feeling the heat of the flames licking at their skin, but they pressed on, driven by something they couldn't explain. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe guilt, but they couldn't turn back now. They believed, deep in their hearts, that they deserved the fire's punishment. It was the only way they could pay for what they had done. But as they reached the edge of the fire, something shifted in them. Something inside their soul stirred, and they realized, too late, that this was not the cleansing they had hoped for. The fire didn't burn away their sins, it only consumed them. It made them hollow, leaving them in a place where there was no peace, no redemption, no return. The heat wasn't enough to purify them. It only left scars, black marks on the soul that never healed, reminders of their choices. They fell back, terrified, feeling the suffocating heat of regret closing in on them. They had chosen the path of fire, but it had not saved them. It had only destroyed them further. But then, there were others who turned away from the fire. They walked toward the river of light instead. At first, they felt unworthy. Their feet faltered as they stepped closer to the gentle waters, the coolness inviting them but making them doubt themselves. They thought of their past, their sins, and they felt they were too filthy to be washed clean. But with every step, the waters didn't judge them. They didn't recoil. Instead, they opened, welcoming, cleansing, forgiving. The river of light didn't just offer peace, it offered understanding. As they stepped deeper into the river, the warmth of the fire seemed to fade away. They felt the healing power of the water wrapping around them like a soft blanket, covering the places where they had once hurt, where they had once failed. With every movement, the water didn't just wash them, it restored them, piece by piece. It took their brokenness and made it whole again. The river of light did not care about the mistakes they had made. It only cared about who they were becoming. It was a gentle reminder that no sin was too great to be forgiven, no darkness too deep to be dispelled by the light. And so, as the two rivers flowed, side by side, they told a story of choice. The fire would take from you. The light would give. But both paths led somewhere, a place of judgment, a place of transformation. Those who walked the path of fire would face the consequences of their decisions. But those who chose the river of light, they would find the peace they sought, the peace that could never be stolen, the peace that was born from redemption, not punishment. And in the end, perhaps, it was the choice between fire and light that truly defined the soul. The sky above them was dark, the clouds swirling in a mass of gray and black, but there was a flicker of light, faint but unmistakable, struggling to break through the overwhelming darkness. The sinners stood, scattered and broken, on the edge of a desolate wasteland. Their faces, once filled with pride and defiance, now carried the weight of guilt and regret. Each step they took felt like walking through the ashes of their former lives. They had made their choices, and now, those choices weighed heavily on them. For the first time, they looked at themselves through eyes that weren't clouded by arrogance or self-justification. They saw the truth of what they had become, fractured souls, broken by the decisions they had made. The flames of their past, The very things they had once embraced, now felt like chains binding them to a never-ending torment. But somewhere, beneath the despair, flickered the faintest glimmer of hope. They had come to a place where redemption was still possible, if they could find the courage to face their sins, to seek forgiveness, and, above all, to believe in mercy. It was quiet, too quiet. The land around them was still, almost as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. But then, like a soft whisper in the wind, a voice broke the silence. Do you truly seek redemption? The question seemed to hang in the air, impossible to ignore. The voice didn't come from anyone they could see, but they knew it was meant for them. It pierced through the darkness, as if a part of their very souls was speaking, beckoning them to answer. One sinner stepped forward, his hands trembling. I am sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I know what I have done. I know the pain I've caused. I know the darkness I've carried with me. His voice cracked with the weight of his words, but there was a rawness in his honesty. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. But still, I ask. He dropped to his knees, the weight of his guilt pulling him down, but his heart remained open. His eyes were wide with fear, yet there was a flicker of something deeper, something more powerful. Hope. Another sinner, a woman whose face was lined with years of regret, joined him. I have hurt those I loved, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I betrayed them, I betrayed myself. I thought I could live without consequences, that I could outrun my mistakes. But now, I stand here, with nothing but the pieces of my broken soul. I need mercy, more than anything. I can't undo what I've done, but I am ready to be better. Please, show me mercy. Her hands clutched her chest, as though trying to hold her broken heart together. Her voice trembled with vulnerability, a stark contrast to the fierce pride that had once defined her. Their voices echoed in the emptiness, but the response they received was not the harshness they feared, not the judgment they expected. Instead, the silence seemed to envelop them, soft and patient. And then, the faintest glow appeared on the horizon, the light growing brighter with each passing second. It was not the blinding light of judgment. It was a warm, comforting glow, like the first rays of dawn after a long, cold night. The sinners stood still, awestruck. Was this the mercy they had begged for? Was it truly possible that they could be forgiven? Was there room for them in the light, or had their sins condemned them to the darkness forever? A figure appeared from the glow, a presence that radiated peace and compassion. It wasn't a being they could understand fully, but they knew, instinctively, that this was something greater than them. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward them, not with condemnation, but with a gentle invitation. It was an offer. A chance. Your past does not define you, the figure's voice spoke, not in words, but in a way that resonated deep within their hearts. Your sins are heavy, yes. But they do not have to be the end of your story. The warmth of the light seemed to wrap around them like a comforting embrace, easing the weight of their regret, if only for a moment. Mercy is not about forgetting what has been done, the figure continued. It is about letting go of the belief that you are beyond redemption. It is about opening your heart to change, to becoming something better than what you were. One by one, the sinners fell to their knees, not in defeat, but in surrender. They had lived their lives holding on to their pride, their anger, their sins, but now, for the first time, they let go. The act of surrender was not one of weakness, it was one of strength, of humility, of understanding that they could not do this alone. Their hearts, once hardened by years of guilt and shame, were now open to something new. The first sinner, the man who had knelt in the dust, felt the weight of his heart lift. He could feel it, a lightness, as if something deep inside him had been released. For the first time, he felt the stirring of something that he had long believed lost, hope. The burning need to atone, to make things right, was still there, but now, it no longer consumed him. Instead, he felt the space within himself fill with something gentler. It was forgiveness. And with it came the realization that forgiveness was not a gift he could earn, it was something that had always been there, waiting for him to accept it. The woman beside him stood taller, her posture no longer burdened by shame. She felt as though the chains that had bound her for so long were breaking, one by one. Her breath came easier, her chest no longer weighed down by the suffocating pain of her past. She, too, was ready to accept the forgiveness that had been offered, to step into the light and leave the shadows behind. The land around them, once barren and lifeless, seemed to stir with life. Tiny shoots of green began to sprout from the ground, the dry earth beginning to soften. It was a subtle change, but undeniable. As they rose, the sinners felt a new sense of peace settle within them, a quiet understanding that redemption was not a destination, it was a journey, a continuous act of letting go, of trusting, of being worthy of mercy. The light grew brighter, and with it, their hearts began to heal. They had been lost, but now, they had found their way back. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken words, and the earth beneath their feet felt heavier than ever. The sinners, now marked by their past actions, stood on the edge of a precipice. Their hearts were torn, still burdened by the weight of their mistakes. But before them stood a new opportunity, one that neither promised forgiveness nor offered immediate relief. It was a challenge, a trial that would demand more from them than they had ever given before. A voice echoed from the skies, clear and powerful, like the ringing of a bell. "You have been given a second chance," it said, each word like a spark that ignited something deep within. But redemption does not come easily. It is earned, not bestowed. To prove your worth, you must face the test of renewal. The ground rumbled, and before them, the air shimmered, pulling back to reveal a path of stones leading through a dense forest of twisted trees, their branches heavy with dark fruit. The path was narrow, and the light from above barely pierced the thick canopy. But something about it called to them, beckoning them forward with the promise of something they could hardly comprehend. For those standing there, it was both a relief and a curse. They had been given a chance to change, but only if they were willing to endure the trial. Their souls, fractured and broken by their own choices, now had to rebuild themselves through acts of selflessness, something none of them had fully embraced before. The first to step forward was a man, his face gaunt from years of regret. His hands, once clenched in anger, now trembled with fear. He had been selfish for so long, taking, never giving. But now, in this moment, he felt something stir inside him, something he had buried long ago, the desire to be better. To be different. "I will try," he whispered to himself, and then, with one last glance back at the others, he took the first step onto the path. The stones beneath his feet were cold and smooth, as though testing his resolve with every step he took. His heart raced, but with each stride, the feeling of fear lessened. He was moving toward something. He didn't know what. But he was moving. They stood at the edge of a wide, dry riverbed. The river had once been full and flowing, a lifeline to all who needed it. But now it was barren, cracked earth stretching endlessly before them. The sinners, lost and wandering, looked to the righteous for answers, for direction. But the righteous had their own questions. How could they guide others when they themselves were still learning? How could they show the way when they were unsure of their own steps? A woman, her heart pure but her hands trembling, stepped forward. She was one of the righteous, having walked through the fire of her own redemption. She had faced her demons, fought against the weight of her own mistakes, and emerged stronger. But now, the task ahead of her seemed impossible. How could she help the others when her own past still haunted her every waking moment? She looked at the sinners, her gaze softening. They were so like she had been, lost, broken, unsure. They were reaching out, desperate for something they couldn't quite name, and she knew they had no one else to turn to. She could feel their cries, their silent pleas for mercy, echoing in her chest. But even as her heart ached for them, she felt a coldness creep in. Was it enough to just want to help? Was wanting to ease their pain enough to carry them through the darkness? The woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over her face. She remembered the days when she had been where they were, when all she had was a small flicker of hope to guide her. And yet, here she was, standing in front of them, a beacon of light. The paradox was heavy. They needed her, but she needed them just as much. "How can I help them?" she whispered to herself. "How can I guide them when I don't even know where to go?" A voice answered, soft but clear, almost like a whisper in the wind. "You walk beside them, not ahead of them. You are not their savior, but their companion on this journey." The words felt like a balm to her heart. It wasn't about leading them from a place of superiority or strength, it was about walking with them, showing them that they weren't alone. She wasn't there to carry them, she was there to remind them that they could carry themselves, to help them see that within themselves was the strength they needed to move forward. The righteous didn't have all the answers. They didn't know the way perfectly. But they had walked through the darkness, and now, they could be the light that illuminated the path for others. And that, she realized, was the true burden they had to bear, not to be perfect, but to be present. The crowd of sinners grew restless, their eyes filled with expectation. The righteous man next to her, an older figure, his face weathered by time and experience, stepped forward. He had been through more trials than most, his hands worn from years of labor and sacrifice. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and full of authority, yet there was an unmistakable warmth to it, as if the burden of his wisdom had been tempered by compassion. "Redemption isn't a destination," he said, his words carrying across the stillness of the riverbed. "It's a journey, one step at a time. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to take one step forward, and then another." The sinners listened intently, their faces a mixture of hope and disbelief. It was hard to believe in something they couldn't see, but the righteous had shown them that it was possible. The words rang true, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the air itself had shifted. The heavy burden they had carried for so long had lessened, if only by a fraction. But there was still more to come. The righteous knew that the weight of their responsibility was not something that could be shrugged off easily. As they turned to guide the sinners forward, they could feel the quiet pressure of the task before them. How could they walk beside these lost souls when they themselves were struggling to remain steady? Each righteous soul faced a different dilemma. One man, whose heart had been filled with righteousness for years, struggled with doubt. He had always believed that the path he walked was the only true one. But now, with the sinners standing before him, he questioned everything. Was he really the right one to guide them? Did he have the answers they so desperately needed? Could he show them the way without losing his own sense of purpose? Another righteous soul, a young woman, found herself torn between compassion and discipline. She had once been taught that redemption required strict adherence to certain rules. But now, seeing the raw humanity in the sinners, she wasn't sure if the rules were enough. Was there more to redemption than just following the rules? Could the sinners find their way through the warmth of love, not just through rigid doctrines? It was a constant struggle for the righteous to balance their own doubts with the needs of those they were meant to guide. The responsibility was heavy, and at times, it felt as though it might break them. But there was a quiet strength that lived within them, a resolve to keep moving forward, not for their own sake, but for the sake of those they served. As they walked alongside the sinners, their steps slow but sure, the burdens of the righteous seemed to lighten, not because the task had become easier, but because they had learned to share it. With each act of compassion, each moment of understanding, they not only helped the sinners but helped themselves as well. The path was still uncertain. The future still unknown. But the righteous had learned something valuable that day, that they were not alone in their journey. They walked with the sinners, side by side, both groups finding strength in one another. And that was enough. That was all they needed to carry on. The air was thick with silence, as if the earth itself had paused, holding its breath. The crowd gathered beneath the dying light of the setting sun, their eyes wide with anticipation. They had followed the prophet for so long, through trials and teachings, through despair and hope. Yet this moment, this final moment, was unlike any they had ever known. The prophet, an old figure with a presence that commanded reverence, stood before them, his hands trembling slightly as he held a single, shattered star in his palm. As he walked deeper into the forest, he came across the first of many trials. An elderly woman, her body frail and hunched, stood in front of him, holding a heavy basket of fruit. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, seemed to burn with a quiet urgency. She looked at him with pleading eyes, as though waiting for something, for him to act. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man stood still, staring at her. His mind raced. He had nothing to offer her. He was empty, broken. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of selfishness. But then, something inside him broke open, a flicker of something pure. He reached out, taking the basket from her hands. His fingers brushed against her weathered skin, and in that moment, he felt something shift. It wasn't just the basket he took. It was a small piece of his own selfishness, a fragment of the pride he had clung to for so long. "You have my thanks," the woman said, her eyes welling with tears. But she didn't just thank him with words. She smiled, a smile that radiated warmth and gratitude. And that was when the man felt it. A warmth spreading through him, a softness in his chest that had not been there before. The path before him opened up wider, and he continued on, his steps now lighter, more sure. But with every step, the trials grew harder. A child, lost and frightened, appeared in his way, her small body trembling with fear. She reached out to him, her face a mirror of the pain he had once carried in his own heart. "Please," the child whispered, "help me find my way home." He could have turned away. He could have ignored her, as he had so many times before when others had asked for help. But something was different now. He knelt down, wiping away her tears with the sleeve of his shirt. He didn't have the answers, but he knew what he had to do. With a gentle hand, he guided her through the woods, reassuring her with every step. And when they reached the edge of the forest, where the child could see her home in the distance, he left her there, watching her run toward safety. A strange sense of peace settled within him. He had not only helped her, but in doing so, he had helped himself. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, had chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. Others followed him, stepping into their own tests. Some helped strangers they met along the way. Others gave their time, their energy, their very hearts, in ways they had never imagined before. Each person, struggling with the weight of their past sins, now found strength in the act of giving. They were not perfect. They were not transformed completely. But in these small moments of selflessness, they were finding a path toward renewal. One woman, whose life had been marked by betrayal and deceit, found herself face to face with a man who had once been her enemy. He was weak, suffering from wounds she had caused. And for a moment, she hesitated. The old anger, the old fear, gripped her heart. But then, the path before her seemed to glow with light, as if urging her to do something different. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she offered him the water she had found in a stream. He looked at her with disbelief, his eyes wide. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracked. "Because I have learned," she whispered, "that it is never too late to change. And I am sorry for what I did to you." The man said nothing, but as he took the water, he nodded, acknowledging that perhaps, in this strange moment, there was hope for them both. The path was long. The trials were hard. And yet, with each selfless act, with each moment of giving, the sinners felt the weight of their past sins lifting. The world around them seemed to respond, too. The trees that had once been twisted and dark began to bloom with flowers, their colors vibrant and full of life. The sky above, once heavy and oppressive, now seemed to clear, revealing a soft blue light that bathed the land. By the time the sinners had reached the end of the path, they had changed. They had learned the truth of the test of renewal. It was not about perfection. It was about transformation, about the willingness to step outside of oneself and offer something pure, something that could heal both them and the world around them. They stood together, no longer as sinners, but as people who had found the strength to face their past and become something more. The test had not been easy, but it had shown them the path to redemption. And though their journey was far from over, they now knew that they had the power to continue moving forward, one selfless act at a time. The weight of the world hung heavy in the hearts of the righteous, each step forward carrying more than just their own burden. They had walked through the trials of the past, emerged from the darkness with their souls intact, and now stood at the threshold of a new responsibility. It wasn't enough to simply be saved. They were tasked with guiding others, those who had faltered, those who had sinned, those who now sought redemption. It was a role that had come with no instruction, no map, no clear path forward. The day was quiet, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the land. In the distance, a group of sinners stood, their faces drawn with fear and uncertainty. They had come to ask for help, to seek the guidance of those who had found their way. The righteous could see the pain in their eyes, the same pain they had once known. But now, it was their turn to offer something in return. The star, though broken, glowed faintly, as if still clinging to the remnants of its once unyielding light. Its broken edges were jagged and sharp, casting brief, flickering shadows on the faces of the people who stood before him. They waited for his words, their hearts heavy with a mix of fear and longing. What would the prophet say? What truth could he offer that had not already been said? And yet, there was something in his gaze, something that seemed to promise a revelation that would change everything. With a voice that cracked with age and wisdom, the prophet began, his words carrying like a whisper that reached into the deepest corners of their souls. This is the tale of the shattered star, he said, holding the broken star aloft, its faint glow growing stronger as he spoke. A story not of endings, but of beginnings. The crowd leaned in, their breaths held in unison. There was a weight to his words, a gravity that felt different from anything they had heard before. Once, long ago, the prophet continued, his voice softening, there was a star, bright and whole, shining with a light so pure that it illuminated all the darkness around it. This star was the center of all things, the source from which life, love, and truth flowed. All who looked upon it found warmth, and all who followed its light found their way. His eyes drifted to the horizon, as if remembering a time that had passed but never fully left. But the star grew restless. It saw the world below, filled with pain, greed, and suffering, and it began to doubt its own light. It wondered if its brightness could truly heal the wounds of the world, if its light could guide the lost souls who wandered in the darkness. It feared that its light was not enough, that it might burn out before it could heal all that was broken. The crowd stood in rapt attention, the air heavy with the weight of his words. They could feel the truth in them, a truth that stirred something deep inside their hearts. The star's doubt, the prophet went on, his voice soft with sorrow, grew into a fear so deep that it shattered itself. It broke apart, its pieces scattered across the heavens. Its light dimmed, and the darkness below seemed to grow ever deeper. The world was left in shadow, and the people who had once followed its light were lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The prophet paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind, rustling through the trees. It was as if the world itself was waiting for the next part of the story, a part that they all knew was coming, but could hardly bear to hear. But in the brokenness, the prophet continued, his voice gaining strength, the pieces of the star began to move, to seek each other. They did not understand why they were broken, or how to find their way, but they knew that they could not remain scattered forever. Slowly, they began to draw closer, to reunite. And as they did, their light, though fractured, began to shine once again. A light shimmered in the prophet's eyes, as if he too could see the light returning. And so, the pieces of the star came together. One by one, they touched and fused, their light growing brighter with each reunion. The brokenness became a strength, for in the darkness, the light had learned to be more than it had been before. It had learned to shine not in perfection, but in unity, in togetherness. The crowd was still, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of his words. Each person felt the truth of the story deep within them, the brokenness they had all felt mirrored in the shattered star. They had all been lost at one point or another, their light dimmed by the weight of their mistakes, their doubts, their fears. But the prophet spoke of something else now, something that seemed impossible yet undeniable, the power of coming together, of finding the light again in the darkest of places. The star, the prophet said, his voice growing firm and resolute, did not need to be whole to shine. It did not need to be perfect to bring light to the world. In its brokenness, it had become something more, something that could guide others through the darkness, something that could heal the world, not despite its cracks, but because of them. He lowered the star, its glow now brilliant enough to light the path ahead. And so it is with us. We, too, are broken. We, too, have wandered in the darkness, unsure of our place in the world. But like the pieces of the shattered star, we can come together. We can find our way back to the light, not by being perfect, but by embracing our brokenness, by coming together in our shared struggle. The crowd remained silent, the weight of the words sinking in. They could feel the truth of them in their hearts, as if the shattered star had become a mirror for their own souls. They had feared the darkness, feared the brokenness that lived within them. But now, they understood. The darkness was not something to be feared, it was something that could be overcome, not through perfection, but through unity, through love. The prophet's final words echoed in the stillness of the air. The reunion of humanity with divine truth is not a return to perfection, but a return to love, to compassion, to understanding. We are all broken stars, each of us carrying a piece of the light. And when we come together, when we heal one another, we become whole again. And as the prophet's voice faded, the people stood in silence, their hearts full. The sky above them was no longer dark, for the broken pieces of the star had reunited, and the light that had once been lost was now shining brighter than ever before. The world stood still, suspended between the breaths of night and day, as if time itself had paused. The sky above, once a deep, unbroken void, was now threaded with threads of light and shadow, swirling in perfect harmony. It was a quiet moment, a moment before everything that had been torn apart would begin to heal. The winds, once fierce with the weight of change, had calmed. The earth, weary and scarred, seemed to pulse with a slow, steady beat, as if it too was waiting for something, the end of one story, the beginning of another. Below, the people gathered once more, their faces painted with a quiet reverence. They had lived through the judgments, the trials, and the moments of truth that had shaped their hearts. They had witnessed the rise and fall of stars, the dance of light and darkness. Now, they stood on the threshold of something greater, something more profound than they could ever fully understand. They knew that the final chapter of the story was upon them, and with it, the promise of something new. The prophet stood before them, his eyes reflecting the changes in the world around him, the world that had been broken, judged, and then slowly rebuilt. His voice, when it came, was soft, yet full of power, as if it carried with it the weight of all that had been learned, and all that had yet to be understood. Everything that has come before, the prophet said, has been a part of a greater truth. Judgment is not the end, but the turning of a page, the closing of a chapter only to open another. The cosmic balance, the eternal cycle, is not one of destruction, but of renewal. The people stood still, as the words sank in. It was a concept that many had struggled to grasp, the idea that judgment, with all its finality, was not the last word. That the darkness, once feared as the end of everything, was simply a part of a greater whole, one that could not exist without its light. The prophet's words were not just a comfort, they were a revelation. Look at the sky, the prophet continued, gesturing upwards. What you see is not a single moment of light, nor a single moment of darkness. It is a dance, an eternal balance, one where each has its place. The light does not exist without the darkness, and the darkness does not exist without the light. Both are needed, not to destroy, but to create. To guide. To renew. A soft murmur ran through the crowd. They could see it now, the way the two forces intertwined above them, how the light and the dark did not fight, but swirled together in an intricate pattern, one shifting, and then the other, a beautiful and chaotic harmony that never stopped, never ceased. It was a reminder that the world, in all its brokenness and beauty, was not meant to be fixed in a single moment. It was meant to evolve. The judgment, the prophet went on, is not a reckoning of who has failed or who has succeeded. It is the moment when we shed our skins, when we release the weight of what has been and become what we are meant to be. It is not the end, but a transformation. The light rises from the darkness, and the darkness gives way to the light. This is the eternal balance. For a long moment, the air was thick with the weight of this truth. The people could feel it deep within them, as though the world had just shifted, and they had been given a glimpse of something beyond themselves. The weight of judgment, the fear of what was to come, had seemed so real for so long. But now, in the prophet's voice, they understood. Judgment was not about finality, it was about the constant turning of the wheel, the eternal cycle that was both personal and universal. Think of the river, the prophet continued, how it is never the same, yet always the same. The waters flow, change course, rise and fall, but they are never lost. They are always part of the great stream. And so it is with us. We are all part of something greater, something that moves beyond the individual, beyond the moment of judgment. We are part of a greater whole, a whole that is never complete, but always growing. His words seemed to hang in the air like the last remnants of a storm, calming yet potent. The people listened in silence, the weight of those words settling on their hearts. They had been given a new vision, a vision where judgment was not a moment of reckoning, but a step in the continuous cycle of life, death, and rebirth. A vision where light and darkness were not enemies, but partners in the endless dance of creation. The path you have walked, the prophet said softly, the struggles, the pain, the moments of triumph, all have led you here, to this moment. And in this moment, you have a choice. To remain as you are, holding on to the past, or to step into the next phase of the eternal cycle, embracing both your light and your shadow. For only when you do this, only when you understand that both are needed, can you truly know peace. It was a choice they all faced. The world had changed. They had changed. And now, they stood on the brink of something new, something both terrifying and beautiful. They could feel it in the very air around them, the promise of renewal, of growth, of a harmony that transcended the battles of good and evil, light and dark. The sky above was no longer a divided expanse, but a unified whole, the light and the dark moving together in a seamless flow. It was a reminder that all things, whether joyful or sorrowful, were part of a greater rhythm, a greater harmony, that could never truly be broken, only transformed. And as the prophet's voice faded into the evening air, the people understood. They had walked through the trials of judgment, through the darkest valleys of their souls, and had come to a place of understanding. The darkness had not defeated them, nor had the light. Both had shaped them, had helped them grow. And now, they stood ready to embrace the next step, knowing that it was not an end, but a new beginning. The world, like the river, would continue to flow, and they, like the waters, would move with it. The eternal balance had been restored, not just in the heavens, but in their hearts as well.